Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video we're going to finish up Unit 14, the financial sector, by talking about the loanable funds market. So the loanable funds market is our graph for this unit, and it takes what we learned about interest rates and gives us an opportunity to apply it. So the loanable funds market is simply the supply and demand for loans, right? A loan is giving money to a borrower, and the borrower is going to pay it back plus interest. That's the idea of the loanable funds market. And so I thought it would be a good idea just to go ahead and draw the graph first and then dissect it a little bit. So let's go ahead and do that. So it's just going to be one graph for the loanable funds market. We don't need to do any side by side. And if you remember, in a normal supply and demand graph, we have quantity on the x-axis, price on the y-axis, and that's sort of the case here as well. Instead of quantity by itself, we would say this is the quantity of loans, because that's the good or service we're talking about here. So really, this isn't that different from normal supply and demand, except we're just talking about a specific good, in this case, loans. And yes, you can abbreviate that with a capital Q if you'd like. Now for price, we need to know what is the price of a loan. And if you've already guessed that's the interest rate, you're correct. Except we need to be a little more specific than just saying interest rate. What we want to say here is this is the real interest. Sometimes it doesn't let me do a period there. Real interest rate. Okay. Now, why is it the real interest rate over the nominal interest rate? Because remember, a lender is concerned about the real rate of return, right? And that's what loans are all about, is how can the lender get what it really wants, right? The real rate of return outside subtracting out inflation. We abbreviate the real interest rate by a lowercase r. Okay, so make sure you use the lowercase r. Do not abbreviate with an I or an IR or INT or whatever. Just use a lowercase r if you're going to abbreviate. In terms of the shape of the curves, they're just like a regular supply and demand graph. Downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. Where those intersect, that is going to be the equilibrium quantity of loans and the equilibrium real interest rate. So nothing too crazy in terms of the graph here, right? It's basic supply and demand. The only thing that's different is the labels on the axes. We have quantity of loans, because that's the good we're talking about. And then we have real interest rate, because that's the price of a loan, the interest rate. So that's the loanable funds market as a graph. But let's go ahead and dissect each curve and who they represent. The demand curve here represents borrowers because they want a loan. They demand a loan. They need a loan. And these borrowers can be consumers, they can be businesses, they can be governments. All three categories borrow money, right, for various things. Consumers may want a car. Businesses may want to grow their company. Governments may want to finance deficit spending and be able to spend money they don't have, right? That's the demand for loans. And we can see, if we go back to the graph here, the downward sloping demand curve, there's an inverse relationship between real interest rate and the quantity of loans demanded. Why? Because when the interest rate is higher, people don't want to borrow as much, right? Because they're going to have to pay more interest. But when the interest rate is lower, people want to borrow more money because they don't have to pay as much back in terms of interest. So demand represents borrowers. Supply represents lenders / savers. And these are the people who want to give out loans, right? They have money saved up that they're willing to lend out. These could be banks, these could be individuals, a lot of different categories for lenders as well. And we can see, if we go back to the graph once again, there is an upward sloping supply curve, which means that there is a positive relationship between the real interest rate and the quantity of loans supplied. Why is that? Because when the interest rate is higher, lenders want to lend out more money because they're going to get more money back in terms of interest. They can make more money the greater the interest rate, the higher the interest rate. We can categorize saving here into one of two types. Private saving is the amount of money households, individuals like you and me, save. And then public saving is the amount of money the government saves. And if we add those two types of saving together, we get what's called national saving, which is the sum of private and public saving. The supply curve here in the loanable funds market represents national saving, the sum of household saving, private saving, and government saving, public saving. So that's the supply curve for loans. Now you may be thinking, oh my gosh, there's curve shifters, right? These curves can shift. And yes, they can, but there really isn't any like specific shifters, right? Because remember when we did like regular supply and demand, we said, hey, input prices go up, supply left. Here, it's more vague. It's just anything that influences the behavior of borrowers will shift demand. Anything that influences the behaviors of lenders or savers will shift supply either left or right. So you just have to ask yourself who's being affected here, borrowers or lenders, and is that going to make them want to borrow more or less or lend more or less? So I gave you an example in each case. So for example, say the government wants to finance deficit spending. Well, to do that, it's going to have to borrow money. And so if I go back to my graph, that would move demand to the right. Okay, so if demand moves to the right, that means the interest rate increases. So maybe ER1. Okay, so that's an example of demand shifting, because they're going to want to borrow more money. So I'm going to get rid of this because we're going to do a supply shift in a second. And then for supply, anything that influences the behaviors of lenders or savers. So for example, if there's political instability in a country, meaning the country's in turmoil, maybe you don't want to lend as much money because you're afraid, oh my gosh, is this person going to pay me back? Are they going to be alive to pay me back? There's a lot of dangerous stuff going on. And so maybe that convinces people to lend less. And so that's going to move supply to the left, which will also, in this case, increase the equilibrium interest rate to R1. So nothing too crazy or tricky there. They're usually pretty transparent on the AP exam in terms of whether it's going to shift demand or supply. So you just kind of have to ask yourself, is it a borrower question or a lender question? And then which way do I shift the curve? Now, in the demand example, you notice that when the government wants to finance deficit spending, meaning spending on top of what it gets in tax revenue, it has to borrow money. And you saw in the example with demand that increases the interest rate. This has a name, and it's called crowding out. It's the idea that when the government borrows money, the real interest rate increases. And because the real interest rate increases, businesses and consumers are going to borrow less money. It's making them harder to borrow money because now they're going to have to pay this higher interest rate. So businesses can't invest, consumers can't buy new cars, houses, etc., and that's going to hurt economic growth because that's less GDP, right? We borrow money to spend money, right? That's GDP, that's aggregate demand. And so when the government's borrowing money, it's basically forcing other people who demand money, who borrow money, demand, I should be careful there, demand loans or want to borrow money, loaning out that money, it's making it harder, right? It's making it harder for businesses and consumers to borrow because now they face a higher interest rate, and that's called crowding out. And that is a topic you see very frequently on the multiple choice section of the AP exam. So make sure you know what crowding out is. It's the idea that when the government borrows money, that moves loanable funds demand to the right, increasing the interest rate, the real interest rate, and which will then make it harder for businesses and consumers to borrow money because they face a higher interest rate. And in doing so, that will hurt economic growth, i.e. real GDP. So that's all for this video on the loanable funds market. Until next time, have a great day.